Thank you to my newest patron, Glenn Courier. I appreciate your generosity, and as always, you can reach me with any questions or concerns via Patreon PM, Minds.com, or Twitter at A Helping Hand for Me. Every dollar helps, every dollar is appreciated, and every pledge of $10 or more will earn you a permanent spot in my video credits. Here's an idea. Instead of whinging about those hurt Kim Possible fans and trying to pin your failures on them, how about you own up to the fact that you screwed up your research and made a dumb as dog shit analysis? You were completely right about the sitcom Think, about the dumb dad that can't wipe his ass without his woman, fair enough, but the fact that you keep attacking Kim fans instead of saying, yeah, fine, I did a derp, just shows that you're not willing to self-examine or admit when you fail. And if you're going to start doubling down when you're called out, your opinions will matter that much less, and no one will trust your facts. Alright, Reckless Fire 29, fair enough. Since so many of you seem to be of the opinion that I was unfair to Kim Possible as a series, I'm going to go ahead and do you a solid. I'm going to put aside any and all of my previous impressions from the show, take a big, objective step back, and put it through the analysis you feel it deserves. After all, my aspiration and my passion are in the crafting of fiction, not in complaining about social justice. I'm writing this introduction before having watched anything, assuming a completely clean slate. Regardless of my previous opinion, I'll be giving my honest opinion as I perceive it now, being an admission of fault or doubling down. Before I get into that though, I think it's important to clear up exactly what the previous video was about, since so many of you seem to be completely misunderstanding it. First of all, the introduction where I tried to put into perspective how long ago I wrote that piece was not me bragging. If I actually did something about it, if I was actually proactive and started a channel about it back then it would be bragging. But I didn't. I saw it, was momentarily annoyed by it, and then stowed it away in the back of my mind because I was too focused on my own ambitions to care. And it's not to say anything against any of the people I mentioned, because at the time, feminism and social justice were not the focus of the skeptic community. It hadn't even reached its next surge of popularity yet, and it wouldn't find its way into that particular limelight until the Gamergate controversy a decade later. That introduction was to show that hindsight is 20/20, and to note my regret that I did not get into the fight sooner. It was to demonstrate that even when we see something coming, we never know exactly how bad it can get, but that inaction can be the difference between weathering or dodging a disaster. And it was to ponder what the next decade and a half might bring if the social justice movement maintains its current momentum. Second, I've been hearing comments from quite a few people who liken what I said in that video to the narrative-slinging apologetics and conspiracy theories of certain social justice warriors. Honestly, as someone who despises SJWs and their need to censor and attack every show, movie, or game or whatever for retarded reasons without looking past their triggers in it, I felt the same disgust watching your video. Half of the movies and shows that you listed are not social justice bullshit. 12 Years a Slave is pushing an agenda? Are you kidding me? It's a historical movie about actual racists back in the day when it was a thing. Bunny Stygian, when you say agenda, the more specific word you're looking for is narrative. And you did not hear me use the word narrative when referring to any of those movies or shows, not once. For that matter, I didn't use the word agenda either. I make it a point to choose my words carefully, because I know what the word narrative means. You apparently do not. And before you can understand what narrative means, you need to understand what the word meme means. When you hear the word meme, you no doubt think of simplistic and widespread internet jokes like lolcats, epic fail guy, or Pepe the Frog. And while these things are true to the definition of that word, they neither explain it nor give an accurate idea of its true scope. A meme is an idea or a set of behaviors that is passed down from any intelligent creature to its progeny and social network via observation and repetition. It is a passive process, not a deliberate or malicious agenda to carve a belief into the collective psyche. An animal that remains still to elude a predator that detects prey based on movement is a meme. Looking both ways before crossing the street so as to avoid being run over by a car is a meme. A joke is a meme. Racial prejudice is a meme. A gender stereotype is a meme. These things are passed down by either direct or vicarious experience until they eventually make such a strong impact on the collective consciousness that they shape our perception and interpretation of reality. A narrative, on the other hand, is something entirely different. A narrative is the deliberate attempt to daisy-chain a set of memes together in order to steer their interpretation by the masses. And the easier these memes logically flow together, the easier it is to steer that interpretation, the more effective the narrative will be. Shows like Roots and movies like 12 Years a Slave do not push a narrative, they reinforce a meme. And that meme is, white people once oppressed black people. That very same meme is also reinforced in movies like Remember the Titans, which revisit the history surrounding Jim Crow laws and segregation. They remind us of the conflict that once raged between these two races during a time when these things should be forgiven, because the vast majority of the whites alive today had nothing to do with it, and the vast majority of the blacks alive today did not suffer it. Despite our capacity for logic, we remain creatures of conditioning. We form an understanding of our environment by extrapolating our past experiences into predictions of the future. And vicarious experience, however poorly interpreted, is every bit as powerful as direct experience in the forming of these memes. With that particular meme having already been in circulation for centuries, it becomes very easy to assume that any wrong done to a black person by a white person, particularly a white person in a role of authority, was done on the basis of racism. It becomes very easy to weave a narrative that will transform the meme "white people once oppressed black people" into the meme "white people oppress black people." And, in conjunction with a number of other psychological phenomena that reinforce and preserve belief, it's why the idea "whites do violence to blacks" is not easy to overwrite in the collective consciousness, even after being presented the statistics demonstrating that black people assault and kill white people much more than the reverse on average. Context and reality become irrelevant, especially in the wake of a psychological idiosyncrasy known as informational influence. That was a clip from a video by Anti-Citizen X, part 1 of his Psychology of Belief series. The link to the playlist is in the description, and I strongly suggest that you all watch it in its entirety and subscribe to his channel, because he demonstrates how, even without a guiding hand with an agenda, the verbal opinion of those who surround us will affect our tendency to convince ourselves of something we either know to be untrue, or at the very least, do not have enough information to objectively confirm, especially when we have reason to believe that espousing an opinion different from that of the collective, whether correct or not, will reflect poorly on our intelligence or the integrity of our moral character. That is how important social cohesion and conformity are to us as a species. That is how deeply ingrained they are within our nature. Memes are the powder keg, and a narrative is the match. The memes in the shows and movies I listed were not deliberate attempts to smear white people or men, which is why they did not dominate the plots of said movies and shows. At best, they were the renewed ideas behind conflicts of our past that keep prejudice alive which should have died off decades ago. And at the very worst, they were misguided attempts to fabricate a simulation of reality based on what we think we know, not an objectively measured truth. I actually enjoyed most of the movies and shows that I listed in that video. The memes that I referred to did not comprise the entirety of their respective plots, and they were not the product of any nefarious design. They were largely background noise, nonchalantly peppered here and there, to be as casually consumed as they were conveyed, and to whatever explosive consequences may come. The reason I said that I saw this coming was not because there were people in the shadows behind these movies and shows orchestrating it with an agenda in mind, but because they were perpetuating contemptuous memes that could easily be strung together in a divisive narrative as soon as someone with an axe to grind saw fit to do so. There are branches of feminism that describe patriarchy the same way, not as the deliberate agenda of some all-powerful group favoring men over women, but as a collection of ideas that were organically conceived over time. And if they use the word patriarchy to refer to our tendency to treat men and women differently, bereft of any malicious intent, this would be the one sense in which they are correct. The human brain is not perfect. It is plagued by many such flaws that facilitate the psychology of belief. Another of those flaws is known as hindsight bias, or in other words, the tendency for one to see a solution as simple and obvious after the solution is revealed, and to assume that others presented with the same problem should come to the same conclusion as easily as one perceives. It is the reason why it never once occurred to me to explain the difference between memes and narratives in my previous video, especially when I knew that I'd be largely addressing people who have been paying as much attention to this discussion as I have. I assumed you would all know to make the distinction, and clearly I was wrong. With that in mind, let's take another look at Kim Possible. The purpose of that video was not to tear down this show or any show in particular. The only reason it was the centerpiece was because that short rant I wrote on a whim in 2004 is the only surviving artifact demonstrating how far back I noticed these things. I did not expect to see such a volatile reaction from so many nostalgic fans, but since I have, and since I don't remember the show well enough to know exactly how fair I was in my assessment, I'm going to revisit it. First, let's take a look at the context of when that piece was written, just to see how justified my take on it would have actually been. In 2004, I was actually 19, so I was incorrect there. I would have turned 20 that year, but that's not really important. I'm gauging the date based on when I posted it to the website where I found it, which used to be an old repository for my writings. But to more accurately date this piece, let's refer to the quote as shown in the newest Disney Channel original movie, Eddie's $1 Million Cook-Off. Now, the memory is a bit hazy, but I do vaguely remember the mindset that led me to writing that piece. It was primarily in response to that episode of Kim Possible, but the straw that broke the camel's back was in seeing that scene that I mentioned from Eddie's $1 Million Cook-Off later that night. And if I remember correctly, Disney had a way of playing their new original movies over and over, rapid fire, multiple times a day, for at least the first couple of weeks after the premiere. And that movie first aired on July 18th, 2003. If I'm estimating correctly, I believe the movie had been around for about a week before I saw it that night, which would date the piece that I wrote on or around July 25th. However, it definitely would have been no later than August 15th, which was the day their next original movie, The Cheetah Girls, premiered, and I'm positive that that movie hadn't aired yet. So when I first wrote that piece, that means that the only episodes of Kim Possible which would have aired, and thus could have informed my opinion in any way, would have been up to Season 2, Episode 5, which also aired on August 15th, 2003. 26 episodes, all of which I will watch now and provide an analysis for all recurring characters and themes. I will also take note of how tightly it maintains a coherent timeline on which these characters grow and change from past experiences. This is important, as it will determine to what degree the surrounding episodes affected each of these characters on the whole. If each episode is largely isolated and inconsequential to the point where no real timeline is observed, then the characters are mainly static, and I would have been more or less justified for singling out that one episode without regard to the rest of the series. If there is a coherent timeline, and these characters do noticeably develop, then the more dynamic that development is, the less justified the isolation of that one episode would have been. So let's have a look. To start, the Disney Channel website summarizes the series as follows. Kim Possible follows the comedic action adventures of a typical high school girl who, in her spare time, saves the world from evil villains, along with her best friend Ron Stoppable, his pet, a naked mole rat named Rufus, and their webmaster buddy Wade, who feeds them vital information via a special communicator device. This girl next door turned superhero foils arch enemies around the globe. Then it's back to her family and homework. Admittedly, I've never been much a fan of the whole normal teenagers who live extraordinary lives angle. It comes off cheesy and obnoxious, in my opinion, especially the older you get. But it is consistent with a pattern marketed toward teens seen in other series they've hosted, such as the famous Jet Jackson and So Weird up to 2001, and Hannah Montana as late as 2011. And they did appeal to a fairly wide array of sub-demographics within that age range. Also, So Weird at least was actually fairly decent. So for now, I'll say that it does make sense from a marketing perspective, and that it isn't necessarily a fatal flaw. Having watched those first 26 episodes, I can tell you right now that there is no significant continuity. The only reference to prior episodes that I could find were in the running gag of Ron's traumatizing experience at summer camp and the recurrence of certain images like the mascot character of the Japanese video game company from the first episode. The entire reason certain shows are made this way is because it prevents the team creating it from writing themselves into a corner, especially when there are many different writers involved throughout the history of that show, and it makes the deadlines more manageable. This isn't the approach you'd want to take with a show that features an involved timeline such as The Walking Dead or Breaking Bad, which require much more planning and nuance. And unlike these shows, there is a high degree of consistency which requires characters with simple and predictable personalities. Kim Possible is no exception. So, while I could go through the finer points of each and every episode, the structure of this show makes that needlessly thorough. And with the current way I have to edit my videos, it would also be a pain in the ass, and draw this out much longer than would be necessary. So what I'm going to do is give an overview of each of the characters of note and my impression of them as they were presented within those 26 episodes, particularly focused on the main four, Kim, Ron, Draken, and Shigo, and with as many examples as I can find. Let's start with the male characters. Specifically, the characters that were given to me in the comments as an example that not every male in the show is a buffoon. The most commonly mentioned was Wade, Kim's webmaster and technician, and I would have to agree, Wade is certainly not a moron. In fact, he's apparently a genius of epic magnitude, spouting pseudoscientific jargon to explain his fantastic gadgets and coming up with simple solutions to seemingly elaborate problems in a matter of seconds. However, here's the problem with Wade. He's hardly a character at all. Yes, he is a person, and yes, he does interact with Kim and Ron. However, his interaction is limited to utility. There are no personal exchanges between him and any of the characters, including Kim and Ron, and there is no pressure on him from any part of the show's environment. It's clear that they toyed with the idea of getting him personally involved more than once, first in episode 1 with a short exchange with his mother, and then again in episode 13, which had him show up in person through a hologram. But they decided against it. His character was limited to his function in Kim's missions and nothing more. Beyond his tinkering, we are never made aware of his personal interests, fears, or struggles. And the fact that it's never even explained how Wade gets these new gadgets to Kim in the first place demonstrates just how deliberate that lack of development was, as answering that question would have more than likely involved in-person contact that would have been awkward without exploring those avenues. And doing so would have complicated the story more than they were apparently willing to accommodate. In the end, Wade's only purpose was intel, and he served little more function than that of the self-destructing messages in the Mission Impossible films. Apart from Wade, the only male character I could find who wasn't dull-witted and ridiculous to some degree was Global Justice's top agent, Will Do, who appeared in episode 7. He was even-tempered, mild-mannered, and competent. But this was ruined by the fact that he was also an egotistical jackass whose constant complaints of working with amateurs only served to make him a stepping stone for Kim's grandeur. The next character mentioned was Kim's father, and while he is not exactly an idiot, being a rocket scientist, he very much is an oblivious, feckless eccentric. Of Kim's parents, most of the earthy wisdom and advice is passed down by Kim's mother, who is much more attuned to Kim personally and able to relate to her at her level. Her father, on the other hand, cannot seem to give advice without filtering it through some wacky anecdote involving his career, which is ultimately lost on Kim altogether. And by feckless, I mean that he has a tendency to absent-mindedly and carelessly throw switches, causing the haphazard malfunction of dangerous machines whenever he is around them for the sake of physical comedy. Not exactly the hallmark of a sterling intellect. This personality trait is projected onto Kim's twin younger brothers who, while curious and evidently bright, are little goblins who tend to leave chaos in their wake. And evidently, Kim's mother was designed more to reflect Kim's level-headedness and practicality. Beyond these two characters, a few people commented about some of the less frequent villains, and among them, the only one that I could say was even remotely intelligent or imposing was Lord Monty Fisk, aka Monkey Fist. While unhinged and slightly goofy at times, he is the only male villain I ever saw who seemed to pose an actual threat. The others, including Professor Dementor, Duff Killigan, and Jackie the Jackal, amounted to little more than infantile dick-measuring contests, laughable motives, and schoolyard roughhousing. Chief among these, of course, was Dr. Draken, and I will address him in his contrast to Shigo along with Ron's contrast to Kim. But before we do that, let's address the fact that I said there were no flawed female characters in this series. And when I say flawed, I don't mean attributes that annoy you as a viewer. I mean attributes that are of a direct detriment to the character herself insofar as how she affects her environment, the other characters around her, and their opinions of her. And with that in mind, I was incorrect, but I'm not referring to Bonnie Rockwaller. Forgiving the fact that Bonnie, much like Wade, is hardly a character at all, her principal flaw of being a catty, vindictive bitch is of minimal impact in this show. If it affects anyone beyond Kim, for whom her screen time is almost exclusively reserved, we never see it, and it does not affect her standing as the evident alpha of the popular crowd. Bonnie's purpose is nothing more than a plot device, a catalyst to heighten Kim's misery when the writers most want us to identify with her, and to make Kim appear more reasonable and amicable by comparison. And no one else, not even Ron after a while, seems to have an opinion about her one way or the other. Her presence is so minimal that, with a few minor adjustments to the scripts, it would fit perfectly within the story if she didn't even exist, and was some kind of tormenting hallucination that only Kim could see. The character I was wrong about is the villain known as DN Amy from episode 5. Though only showing up in one of these episodes, she is the epitome of a flawed female character. She is overweight and unattractive with an overbearing personality and a cringeworthy obsession with stuffed animals, and her desperate attempts to flirt with Mr. Barkin are every bit as strong and off-putting as Ron's attempts seen throughout the series. But this is more than made up for by her apparent genius in the field of genetic engineering. While she is awkward, she is no moron. Still, her presence did add a much-needed contrast to the norm, and they would have been wise to bring her back, especially when held in contrast to characters like Adrenaline, an over-the-top, obnoxious, I'm so fucking extreme dude bro with a vagina, whose only purpose was to be exposed for her fake stunts and make Kim's gallant heroism all the more impressive. And Vivian from Season 2, Episode 2, a seemingly clueless airhead who turns out to be an authority on robotics who, quote, faked being dumb and left the lab because someone who looks like she does is never taken seriously. An absurd talking point of the feminist victim narrative we've been hearing for ages, and clearly a part of the zeitgeist before social justice and third-wave feminism rose to exploit it. And now, onto the stars of the show. Kim and Ron on the side of good, Shigo and Draken on the side of evil. They contrast each other in much the same ways, and they account for most of the irksome misandry in this series. This is going to be extensive and exhaustive, so strap in and get comfortable, because after this, I don't think even the most stubborn of you will be able to accuse me of cherry-picking. Kim and Shigo are self-centered, egotistical, patronizing bitches who can apparently do no wrong, can take down armies of muscle-bound henchmen as if they were made of fucking styrofoam, and are aware that they are surrounded by dipshit man-children and treat them as such.
You! Yeah, you don't touch anything!
Professor, did Killer get...
You! Keep your eyes on the road.
Shigo, you've come back!
What have we learned?
No cloning?
Get in.
Guys, what do we do?
Take turns.
Right.
What happened?
You know, for someone who's supposedly a mad genius, I'm not seeing much of the genius.
Keep it up, Shigo, and you'll see plenty of the mad.
Ooh, scary man.
If there are two expressions that the animators of this show must have grown tired of drawing over and over again, it would have to be these two. This raised eyebrow of disturbed and or disgusted confusion, as if to say, why are you such a freak? And this sour grimace of exasperated annoyance, as if to say, I'm surrounded by fucking imbeciles, why must I be the only person in the world who knows her ass from a hole in the ground? They wear one of these two expressions about 60% of the time over one thing or another, and a solid 90% of the screen time and spoken lines from their male counterparts. As a matter of fact, Kim's second line ever, the first being, "Hey Ron," comes with the first expression as she groans over Ron's strange choice of pet, thereby setting the tone for their relationship right away. I think one of the biggest things that annoys me about Kim's treatment in this show, something I had forgotten about, is the constant insistence on ridiculous exposition about how Kim saved the day in some spectacular fashion. Like the time she saved a pop star show from a backstage fire, saved a village from an avalanche, which Ron of course started, and supposedly wrestled a shark with her bare hands. Always delivered by a momentary background character who provides transport or assistance in some way, and always with the patronizing, no big deal anyone could have done it response from Kim.
Thanks for the lift, Gustavo.
After you rescued my village from the flood last year, Kim Possible, I only wish I could do more.
No big. It was just like swim practice.
Except the Middleton High Pool doesn't have piranhas.
Thanks for the lift, Akut.
No problem, Kim Possible. You saved my life. It's the least I can do to thank you.
It was just an itty-bitty iceberg, so not the drama. Thanks for the lift, Baxter.
My pleasure, little lady. Least I could do to pay you back for helping Buttercup in her time of need.
That emergency delivery of her foal
In the dark.
In the rain.
In a landslide.
was no big.
What the fuck is the point of this? Is it supposed to be a joke? Because in my opinion, it falls flat even compared to the decidedly flat humor in the rest of the series. Yes, we get it. Kim can do anything. It's kind of hard to forget when the show's nauseating theme song reminds you with every viewing. In addition to the show constantly patting Kim on the back for things we never actually saw her do, she is self-centered and egotistical. In episode 2, Ron calls Kim out for being bossy, to which she retorts, "You've got to admit, I usually know what's best." In episode 3, just as Ron is getting the haircut, she actually says, "I know what's best for Ron, even if he doesn't." Later, she is absolutely blown away that Ron isn't home when she calls him, as if he could never have a life that doesn't involve her. In episode 6, she actually forces Ron to get a part-time job with her, then throws a fucking tantrum and quits as soon as Ron proves better than her and gets promoted. She admits to being jealous at the end of the episode, providing her with the perfect opportunity to learn the lesson not to underestimate others, but rest assured, she doesn't learn a damn thing. Episode 7 amounts to a giant proverbial dick measuring contest. Kim's ability to overcome her ego and vouch for Bonnie as cheer captain at the end of this episode would have been a perfect opportunity for her character to develop some humility were it not for the fact that the show first had to set up Agent Will Do as the punching bag. Apparently, she is only capable of seeing arrogance and underestimating others as personality flaws when she is slighted by someone else who exhibits these same traits, even though she has been guilty of them herself the whole time. And even this is ruined when Kim is given one last chance to gloat as Bonnie whines about having to continue working hard, saying, quote, "I give her 2 weeks tops." And of course, she's correct, and is restored to the position of captain as of the beginning of episode 8, thereby having failed to learn the lesson about underestimating people for the second time. Episode 8 sees Kim and Ron swap bodies due to Draken's mind swap machine, and this episode should have been another perfect opportunity for Kim to gain some perspective, some humility, and some appreciation for Ron's personal struggles. Instead, it was spent with Kim wallowing in embarrassment as Ron fucks up her life by being unable to deal with the pressure of being popular, and with Kim showing that she can be an even better Ron than Ron by giving sensitivity training to the bullies who torment him. The experience should have amounted to the lesson that Ron deals with every bit as much social pressure as she does, but without the benefits of being trusted and adored. And while she did remark toward the end that Ron, quote, has it hard enough as it is, this is a lesson that will be forgotten as quickly as it was learned. In episode 10, not only is Kim the primary candidate for class president, she actually elbows Ron to signal him to proudly nominate her. And of course, it is received with applause. Then she admonishes him for the manner in which he nominated her rather than being grateful. Quote, "I wanted to be class president, not class clown." And then she immediately demonstrates a complete lack of faith in Ron as her campaign manager with her typical exasperated embarrassment bullshit. In episode 11, when Ron suggests that she stop being such a hard-ass when it comes to coaching her younger brother's soccer team, she can't be bothered to listen to criticism, least of all from Ron. Later on, in one of the show's rare positive moments, Ron takes the initiative for once to devastating effect, kicking a disco ball such that it reflects the animatronic attacker's beams back at them. Kim compliments him for this without any snark, and seems to have learned the lesson not to be such a control freak, as she proudly declares, "Time to do some hands-off coaching." And then it's ruined by the fact that she can't simply be happy that the kids are having a good time, even though they haven't learned anything, because she's salty about being let go as the team coach. She didn't learn shit. In episode 13, when the football team quarterback, Brick, is misled into enthusiasm about Kim's feelings for him relayed in a falsified school newspaper article by Ron, she is only concerned about breaking his heart insofar as it will, quote, lose them the big game. In episode 20, which is misandric as fuck from start to finish, Kim sees fit to assert herself as an authority on what makes a man, sparing zero sympathy and more than a little annoyance as Ron struggles with the idea of attaining manhood. In the first episode of Season 2, Kim makes her parents use false names while country line dancing in order to stave off the embarrassment of being related to them. And in the third episode of Season 2, Kim demonstrates once again that she did not learn the lesson of not underestimating people or not being salty when Ron is better at something, as she is mortified that Ron has to tutor her in cooking for a home economics class, declaring with her usual exasperation, "This is so wrong." Both Kim and Shigo are insufferable ball-breakers and know-it-alls. In episode 1, Kim can't be bothered to care about Ron constantly being turned down for potential dates for the prom, and Shigo establishes the pattern of undermining Draken's supposed authority by declaring, "Don't stop to tell her the plan." The entirety of episode 2 was spent essentially ridiculing the very idea of Ron being a competent leader. However, he is ultimately responsible for fighting and capturing the mutant Gil, something for which the cheerleaders, the coach, and even Kim acknowledge him, which Kim then promptly ruins by scoffing at the idea of him ever calling the shots on a mission. In episode 3, in response to Ron's concern for the new haircut, quote, disrupting his identity, Kim chooses to ignore his embarrassment and embarrass him further by announcing his haircut and making a spectacle of him. And after the haircut actually helps in terms of his popularity, she suddenly finds it, quote, very annoying that hair care products have become the center of the universe. Calling the hairdresser all the way from France was apparently a smart call when Kim thought she knew what was best for Ron, but the moment he tries to maintain the haircut that was her idea in the first place, she's suddenly annoyed to inconvenience herself or the hairdresser for the exact same purpose. From within the first few minutes of this episode all the way until the end, Kim maintains an air of self-righteousness about Ron being, quote, fine the way he was, even though the change was her idea in the first place. And she is complacent in his being a social pariah and a loser so long as she can keep him under control. In episode 4, when Ron expresses his attraction to Shigo, she retorts, quote, so not your type. Apparently Kim is qualified to decide Ron's type for him. Who'da thunk it, with her knowing what's best for him even when he doesn't. Later, Kim thanks Ron for bailing her out of detention, only to then ruin it by declaring it, quote, a meeting of the Lifetime Losers Club, of which Ron is, of course, a part, seeing as how he's been in detention before as well. She then continues to be an insulting, self-righteous elitist by declaring, quote, I am not one of them, I am a cheerleader. They mean nothing to me, I mean nothing to them. She clearly cannot imagine a situation wherein she is not entirely perfect. Shigo punctuates the ball breaking in this episode by zoning out when Draken dares to think she would be interested in the details of his plan involving a robot tick. In episode 6, when Ron identifies activity on the horizon as suspicious, she essentially spits in his face with, quote, "Thank you, Captain Obvious." While trying to convince Ron to join in working at the restaurant so she can afford a trendy new jacket, he disgusts her with his taco plus nacho equals naco creation, just in case we forgot that he's, an embarrassing slob. And in his refusal to apply, of course, because she knows what's best for him even when he doesn't, she applies for him. She then berates him for showing enthusiasm for the job that she forced him to take in the first place, because how dare he be happy doing the thing she forced him to fucking do. In episode 8, when Ron dares to suggest that Kim has a good life on account of being popular and perfect, she proceeds to mercilessly insult him for being the worthless slob that he is, punctuating it with, "It must be brutal being you." When he suggests that he has an image to maintain, she just stares at him silently, as if to say, "Are you fucking serious?" This entire exchange renders the lesson in episode 3 completely useless, wherein she was supposed to have learned to value Ron for who he is. In episode 13, when Wade tries to provide Kim with a holographic double to avoid having to spend time with her, quote, "creepy, weird cousin Larry," its amicable and agreeable disposition demonstrates that her consistently aloof, sour grapes attitude is apparently essential to her character. Kim opens episode 15 with her disapproval of adrenaline, feeling the need to dictate to Ron and her younger brothers what they should or should not find entertaining. She opens episode 16 by turning her nose up at the advice of a popular fashionista on the grounds that, quote, "everyone should have their own style," completely dismissing her obsession over the jacket in episode 6 and the common interest in fashion that brought her together with Monique in episode 12. She later mocks Ron for, quote, "falling in line with the Kim style fad," even though his own mission outfit has pretty much been a direct copy of hers right from the start. Shigo opens episode 17 by single-handedly defeating no fewer than 10 men in a matter of seconds, and then scoffing at Draken's demand for obedience as the supposed mastermind. In episode 18, Kim turns her nose up at the animology craze Ron brings up, being, of course, the only person in the entire series with a consistent and resistant sense of individuality. And her reply to Ron for recommending it? "Thanks, but I have a life." Of course, she does get into it later, enjoying it as its description of her personality strokes her ego, but she's still embarrassed to admit it. She then abandons it immediately after she learns that Junior is her projected soulmate, as only someone with the ego to approve of something so long as it praises and pleases her could do. In episode 20, when Ron gets stuck in the air vent due to his newly enlarged muscles, Shigo remarks, "So he is as dumb as he looks." Of course he is, Shigo. In episode 1 of season 2, Kim is dumbfounded by Ron's evidently newly acquired intelligence, and to perfectly illustrate her lack of faith in him, she declares, "It's like Ron has been abducted and replaced with someone smart." In the second episode of season 2, when Ron asks if he has a chance with the new ticket vendor girl, she defers to Monique as to whether she should give her honest opinion or lie to protect his feelings, once again demonstrating her complete lack of faith in him. Admittedly, though, this is a slight step up from her total disinterest for his romantic failure in the first episode of the series. And later, for good measure, "Ron, I'm gonna say something I've never said to you before." What? You're thinking too much. Not only making her a ball breaker, but a fucking hypocrite, considering her attraction to Josh Mankey once again in the first episode of the series. Don't you just love this character growth? In the fourth episode of the second season, Kim is dumbfounded that global justice would need Ron for anything, let alone on the suggestion that he is somehow the secret to her success. In fact, this entire episode is just one gigantic ball-busting marathon and an excuse to showcase Ron's uselessness for laughs. And finally, Season 2, Episode 5. When Kim's artificially intelligent car asks in annoyance with Ron's panicking, "Does he do this often?" Kim responds, "Almost daily." Of course, Kim, because that's what a worthless male sidekick does. Now on to the men. Ron and Draken are borderline retarded. I would honestly be surprised if either of them could so much as tie their shoes without the help of their female handlers. Ron has the attention span of a fucking goldfish, and is literally pulled or pushed out of harm's way by Kim damn near every episode, not to mention constantly pulled or pushed from whatever moronic distraction is currently keeping him from complying with Kim's wishes.
Mr. Spinning Tops of Doom, I've got homework.
Goodbye.
Run! Move! Oh, Draken's in Wisconsin.
But you're...
Let's go. Come on!
But thanks for playing.
What?
You'll never guess who needs you. Talk to in the calf.
Let's worry about my poll numbers later. Come on. Come on.
Ron gets this trend started 3 minutes into the first episode, illustrating his stupidity by thinking Tokyo is a city in France, and then by correcting himself for referring to Draken as, quote, our archenemy, when he clearly should have said Kim's archenemy, since Draken apparently doesn't even know he exists. And Draken confirms this almost immediately during their later encounter. Actually, it's Shigo who reminds him, because Draken can't be expected to remember anything, referring to him as, quote, Kim Possible's dopey sidekick. But of course, not before Ron fails to deploy his grappling hook twice. Later, he is apparently the only one, quote, freaked out by Draken's giant robot, which immediately captures him the moment he tries to enter the fray. In episode 2, the running gag is that Ron, and only Ron, is apparently afraid of literally everything. It's not to say that everyone else isn't at least a little jumpy, with the exception of Kim, of course, but it is to say that he's the only one shitting his pants in complete certainty of their doom. For that reason, along with everyone's previously established low opinion of him, the entire episode is spent essentially ridiculing the very idea of Ron being a competent leader. And again, he is ultimately the one who saves the day, which temporarily earns him the cheerleaders' respect, but it doesn't last. In episode 4, right from the beginning, Ron is responsible for Kim's printer being jammed, her being tardy, and her landing in detention. Later, he cannot so much as handle walking through the rainforest without making a complete buffoon of himself. He nearly gets Rufus eaten by spiders, but thankfully Kim is there to save the day. Whatever would they do without her? Well, they'd apparently be shredded by remote-controlled lasers, since he draws a blank when volunteering to deal with them, and immediately defers to Kim. And, as usual, the look on her face says it all. In fact, he apparently doesn't even have the sense to flee for his life when the entire lab starts to explode. And this is far from the last time this sort of deer-in-the-headlights stupor will nearly get him killed, were it not for Kim's gallant rescue. In episode 5, Ron of course manages to get himself captured without even the slightest struggle, proving that he is of zero use on his own as well. In episode 6, Kim actually has to wipe the snow away from Ron's goggles for him. She then thinks nothing of moving on ahead as he struggles with his snowboard, and then comes crashing into the pipeline after she saves the day for the first time, just in time to contribute absolutely nothing. When Draken later declares the buffoon is nothing, find Kim possible, he is surprisingly foiled because Ron makes his way into the lab control center and fucks around with the controls, eventually melting the cheese that composes the building. And one would think that this would be a perfect opportunity for the show to give him a chance to grow, and to prove that he's not someone to be underestimated. But of course not. In episode 8, what better way to embellish Kim's cool exterior than to subject Ron to constant physical buffoonery, such as being bucked off of 2 donkeys. And, of course, to declare that his panicked, accidental discovery of the secret entrance to Draken's lair was not, quote, dumb luck, but in fact, quote, dumb skills. After their bodies have been switched, Ron tries to answer Kim's communicator, to Wade's insult, nice try, brain switch boy. Even while constantly at her side on every mission, even while likewise affected by Draken's brain switch machine, Wade refuses to report to anyone but Kim, and Kim snatches the communicator out of his hands in her usual annoyed exasperation, as if to say, you should know better, further demonstrating both the fact that Wade is more a tool than a character, and that Ron is not to be trusted simultaneously. In episode 9, when attempting to prevent a kidnapping, Ron all but faints upon arrival, contributes nothing to stopping the capture of the scientist, and perpetuates his role of being a completely useless buffoon for Kim to blame and roll her eyes at. Later, even Ron's pet rodent recognizes Kim's father in the photo ages before Ron does, and he stares slack-jawed into the middle distance while Rufus tries to explain that her father could be the next target. And once he gets it, of course, instead of doing the smart thing and warning Kim's father that he's a target, he decides to make a mask of Kim's father's face and get himself captured in his stead. Any time of which it would have bought them, he then spoils by revealing his face for no fucking reason. And for good measure, Kim eventually finds him because Wade apparently microchipped him like a fucking dog in anticipation of his inevitable capture. Draken closes the episode by being undermined by his own robots, and then rocketing himself into the ceiling in an attempt to escape. Fantastic. On a rare positive note, Kim's father is responsible for having the idea to defeat these robots by using a jamming signal. But of course, it isn't enough, and Kim needs to step in for one more round of ass-kicking. You go, girl. His words, not mine. In episode 10, a prince that Kim is tasked with keeping safe from an impending assassination moronically fails to keep a low profile in his publicly declared intent to run for class president at Kim's school. And Ron, of course, encourages him. I suppose we can add another moronic male to this show's roster. In episode 12, Ron is quickly dispatched after attempting to body slam the Jackal, which is, of course, his one and only attempt to help. In episode 13, Ron is the only one shitting bricks while they scale a cliff. Other than that, though, episode 13 is pretty remarkable. People had commented that Ron supposedly stops being so useless the moment he acquires monkey kung fu, which was the premise of this episode. And at the end, Ron actually manages to overtake the villain by himself in Kim's absence. It was at this point that I actually thought the show started to take a turn for the better, as the entirety of episode 14 was a marked improvement across the board. From the beginning of this episode, Ron seems much more cool and collected. He uses a thrown plate to deflect an explosive that would have otherwise killed Kim. While Kim does basically screw over both Ron and her parents in an attempt to secretly attend a party, she at least manages to show compassion and regret for the first time. Draken isn't quite so scatterbrained, Shigo isn't quite as much of a ball breaker. Things were looking up, and I honestly expected things to start getting better. But it didn't last, as episode 15 started to be plagued again by all of the problems I've mentioned so far. Kim returns to her bossy bullshit, and not a hint of that monkey kung fu in sight as Ron gets himself captured by adrenaline without so much as a struggle, and ultimately contributes nothing to the mission except for complications. In episode 16, Ron once again manages to make himself useful by saving Kim from falling to her death. That is, of course, until he fails to watch where he's going, clips his jetpack wing on the corner of a building, sends them spiraling into a crash, and Kim has to save their lives by misdirecting them into a safe landing, to the adoring attention of the local paparazzi, no less. But Ron's idiocy is far from the focus of this episode. This episode goes out of its way to demonstrate that Shigo is the only worthwhile henchman Draken has at his disposal. It also goes out of its way to illustrate that Draken desperately needs Shigo, but the need is not mutual, naturally. Shigo opens episode 20 with her amazing pursuit, while Draken and literally all of his other henchmen are apparently out of shape and worthless. Later, Ron actually attempts to crawl away while Kim defeats one muscle-bound henchman after another all on her own. No signs of this monkey kung fu being of any use yet. This entire episode focuses on the worthlessness of Draken's henchmen compared to Dementors, who were provided by a company that specializes in training henchmen. Apparently this makes precisely zero difference though, as both Kim and Shigo are capable of dispatching them with laughable ease. In episode 2 of the second season, Ron is once again saved from certain death by Kim, pulling him to safety by the arm, this time from a killer robot. And just as it seems that Ron has a good idea to scare off the killer robot by exploiting its self-preservation programming, he is badgered by Rufus and forced to admit that, quote, Wade figured it out. Of course. Right from the beginning of episode 4, Ron catches the item stolen by the ninja, only to immediately trip over a stray cat and lose it. Shortly thereafter, he nearly falls to his death and has to be rescued by Kim, as usual. But that's just the start. Again, this entire episode is spent observing Ron's idiocy in an attempt to decode this, quote, Ron factor. An entire episode literally dedicated to Ron being an idiot for the sake of Ron being an idiot. And after all is said and done, it turns out that, quote, the Ron factor was a non-factor. Apparently the factor to Kim's success was not in Ron, but of course, in Rufus. And finally, in the 5th episode of Season 2, Ron panics about losing Rufus in a runaway remote control car, and Kim brings him back with a simple flick of a switch. Later, Shigo is naturally the only one smart enough to use reverse psychology on Freeman in order to convince him to fix the artificial intelligence in Draken's worthless Destructobots. And being a male scientist, Freeman is the only authority on anything who would be stupid enough to fall for it. But of course, this is to absolutely zero effect as Kim takes the robots apart even with their new, deadly programming, prompting Shigo to declare, that's why you have me around. Exactly, Shigo. Because as a female, you're the only one around him who can do anything right. And on top of all of this, not only is Ron completely useless as a sidekick, he also makes zero fucking sense as a friend. I will spare you another lengthy list of examples of Kim being outright dismissive of his interests and his problems to the point of abandonment, but trust me, they're there, in excess. And Kido61 asks, couldn't it just be that the writers like strong female characters and goofy male characters? The reality is the audience probably liked these characters because they've been shown to get good ratings. Yes, Enkidu, I'm sure that is why they made the characters the way they did. But it is possible to make characters like that without having to be insulting about it. Whether you're a fan of the series or not, Naruto is a perfect example of this. He is a complete fuck-up from day one and a goofball of epic proportions. But that never stops him from pulling through for everyone when it matters, nor does it stop him from bettering himself. In fact, any fan of that series can tell you that the central theme is Naruto rising to greatness despite everyone's low expectations of him. And in addition to that, most of the males in that series are not incompetent fuck-ups. Everyone has their quirks, but it's quite clear that the men are capable of functioning just fine without the wise women holding their hands. And as for strong female characters, you need look no further than Metroid's Samus Aran. Her big gender reveal at the end of the first game came as a shock to most at the time, and yet not an unpleasant one as you might think. Ever since then, in one game after another, she has proven to be one of the most formidable protagonists in video game history, destroying entire planets of bloodthirsty monsters and space pirates at a time, and without having to emasculate and step on the balls of every man in sight. Without any of the game's stories having to remind us every few fucking seconds that she's not a prissy, helpless princess. Let me tell you, I tried my damnedest to find something positive to say about this series, to find something on which I could meet you guys halfway. I tried as hard as I could to find any accomplishment of a man's without a fuck-up attached, or an instance where a woman is imperfect in some way that actually affects her and those around her, and the little you see is the sum total of what I found. I was fully prepared to be wrong, and was honestly hoping that each episode would finally turn things around just so watching them wouldn't have to be such a fucking chore. But with all I've seen, I think it's fair to say at this point that the assessment I gave in the previous video was a fair representation of the series as it existed up to that point in 2004. But you know what? I'm going to go even further. I'm going to take a look at the first and last episodes of the seasons after that point, just to see if it ever did turn around. As I said before, the episode structure of this series doesn't observe a timeline in any significant way. Any improvement to any of these characters or themes would be up to the writers, not to any sense of continuity, and those few episodes should be enough to identify it. So let's start with Season 2, Episode 30. Right from the beginning, Kim has to elbow Ron to keep him from falling asleep during a school field trip presentation, only to chastise him for his loud and obnoxious chewing shortly thereafter. Not a good sign. Bonnie is still an antagonizing bitch to Kim and Kim alone, which still seems to be her only purpose, and it's still of no negative impact to her social standing. Kim's ancestor was worthy of as much ridiculous exposition as she is, apparently having helped the police solve a warehouse arson case, a missing African diamond caper, and probably much more had Barkin's ancestor not stopped Ron's ancestor from babbling on about it. Ron's ancestor is as prone to deer-in-the-headlights distraction as he is, and to touching things he shouldn't touch, much to Kim's ancestor's annoyance. And she is just as prone to making decisions for him and dragging him around by the arm like a 5-year-old. Draken is still consistently the chief weak point of his entire operation, and Shigo is still a ball-breaking know-it-all, traits shared by both their ancestors, wouldn't you know it. Wade has still developed no character or function outside of playing intel and technician for Kim. Ron himself remains far more of a burden than an asset and contributes nothing to the investigation while still being outshined by his pet rodent. And to close, Kim is skeptical of Ron having a heroic ancestor until she learns that an ancestor of hers was probably responsible for all of his victories. Well, so much for Season 2. Maybe we'll have more luck with Season 3. Well, to start, Kim is once again amazed that Ron could possibly have plans that don't involve her, or at all really, and she's mortified that he'd rather spend his night playing video games rather than in her company. Again, not a good start. Draken fucking things up, Shigo breaking balls and being of no help. Yup. Draken's cousin Eddie hits on Shigo, who responds with corporal punishment, as expected. Kim has a meltdown about not being the center of everyone's universe, including Bonnie and the rest of the cheerleaders, whose night she ruined. Fucking hilarious. You know, you'd think she'd call Wade if she was this desperate for attention, but no, it seems he's still just tech support. Alright then. Jealous? Please. Ron's not too busy for me, I'm too busy for Ron. Yep, seems Kim's obnoxious ego is still alive and kicking. Kim tries to join in the fun with Ron and Felix. This should be amusing. Nope, not amusing, just cringeworthy, as Kim tries desperately to sound magnanimous and not bored, proves with her every word that she doesn't pay the slightest bit of attention to Ron's interests, and even crams her face full of food in a way that would otherwise disgust her, all for the sake of bogarting their attention. Fun. Let's see. Cousin Eddie makes a sexist remark to Shigo about babes not driving and gets blasted for it. Draken and Eddie steal a wheelchair. The wheelchair then makes a fool of everyone by itself. I'm sure there's some story behind this wheelchair, but I don't really care to know. Draken and Eddie fight over who gets to drive their Doom V, and Shigo dispenses some parenting to keep the man-children in line. With a little help from Felix, Kim hijacks and destroys the Doom V. Felix seems to be another intelligent male added to the roster, which is good, but as usual, no sign of Ron's supposedly useful monkey kung fu. And just an interesting side note, I find it to be a little bit of a convenient coincidence that the only unfalteringly intelligent males in this series so far have been black and crippled respectively. Even though there may have been no deliberate agenda behind the way this series was written, it would seem that the earliest iterations of the social justice privilege hierarchy were starting to form even then. The Season 3 finale is a full-length movie. It's a pain in the ass, but it supposedly involves Kim getting romantically involved with Ron. That might have meant that she actually treats him like a human being for once, so I thought I'd take a look. I'm not going to give the play-by-play for this one, but suffice it to say that it was everything I expected it to be. As prom approaches, Kim is made to entertain the horrible fate of having to settle for Ron as a significant other. I mean, after all the other cheerleaders are dating sports team captains, and she needs to, quote, make a statement. Draken finally manages to come up with a halfway decent plot, because if he didn't, there's no way they'd fill up the time slot they were going for. But of course, Shigo is there to break his balls every step of the way. Out of nowhere, enter Eric, a guy that sweeps Kim off her feet even though she knows nothing about him and saves her from having to go with Ron. Ron gets salty, but manages to drag Kim from the prom to investigate once Draken's plot enters full swing. Eric is kidnapped by Shigo, Kim and Ron go to save the day, and Ron contributes all of nothing with the monkey kung fu that has still yet to make itself useful. Turns out Eric was one of Draken's drones. Kim decides to settle for Ron once he finally gathers up the balls to ask. Final battle on the rooftops. Kim is victorious, everyone lives happily ever after, and you know what? I'm done. I know I said that I'd look into Season 4, but seriously, I'm done. I just don't care anymore. It's already taken me a week and a half to make this video, and as of writing this, I haven't even started to record yet. The whole experience has taught me a lesson, which is to never go this far to make a point, at least not by myself. In the end, it amounted to a lot of tedious busy work and stupid setbacks that cost me far too much time. Time that would have been better spent tackling other topics and generally doing things that are more productive. And to those of you disappointed with my performance this month, rest assured, this won't be happening again. I do want to be fair, but addressing the bruised nostalgia of a few jilted fans is hardly worth this much trouble. The way I understand it, Season 4 was an encore anyway, and that last movie was supposed to be the series finale, so even if something positive does happen in the final season, it was never a part of the creators' original plans. Besides, I think I've made my point. If you still like this show, God bless you, alright? Fine. If you want to whine about what I said in the comments, fine. Go ahead. My point was valid. I suppose you could say that I cherry-picked by only going after one episode in my first video, but I most certainly did not mischaracterize this show in any way. Every episode that existed at the time I wrote that piece was guilty of everything I described to one degree or another. Ron is a cheerleader at best, if not a pet, and I see no reason to believe that changed at any point hereafter. On one final note, though, I do admit that some people were able to mention sitcoms that I hadn't thought of. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, certainly. I love that show. I have to disagree with the IT crowd, though, as there is a fair amount of the men will be idiots when the woman is away in that one. Not too much, though, as Jen is guilty of a lot of goofy shit herself in that series, and it's hilarious when she is, demonstrating that this should happen more often in other shows. And now that I think about it, I'd probably add Wilfred to that list, too. But still, I can't help but notice that all of the examples provided were non-formulaic in the sense of dealing with monogamous relationships, with the exception of one called Last Man Standing, which I have yet to actually see. Apparently it's available on Netflix, and I'll go ahead and have a look at it since so many of you suggested it. It's actually been a while since I've seen Tim Allen in anything anyway, and I'm kind of curious to see how he's held up over the years. Anyway, for all I know, maybe there are some good redeeming episodes of Kim Possible that I've yet to watch. And I even admit that there are redeeming moments here and there in those that I did watch. If you want to point me toward more of them, be my guest and I'll give you my thoughts. Otherwise, just watch the show for yourselves and form your own opinions, as I have no more patience to defend myself over this. Because on the whole, in my opinion, fuck this show. If the genders were reversed, no feminist organization of today would stand for it. No major television network would be able to air a show wherein damn near every female is an incompetent klutz who has to be begrudgingly babysat by the males around them without the fucking FCC raining down on them with fire and brimstone. You know that as much as I do. In any case, thank you all again for your support. I apologize it took me so long to get this video out. Let me tell you, it was a cumbersome nightmare. I still haven't gotten my PC put together yet, and this laptop isn't going to take much more punishment. So I apologize in advance if there is another gap before my next post, but there may well be, as this one definitely took its toll. Thanks again, and I'll see you all in my next video. Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what you saw here, have a look at my other videos and leave me your thoughts in the comments. If you support my message, then please like, favorite, and subscribe. If you'd like to help this channel improve, you can reach out to me on Twitter or on Facebook with any suggestions. And if you'd like to support me more directly, please consider following me on Patreon, links in the description. Thanks again, and I'll catch you all in my next video.